but we are a power run team with a bunch of farm kids in rural Illinois that we prioritize their health, we prioritize their speed, and we get our guys to play extremely physical and extremely fast because they feel good, they feel excited about Friday night, they're not worn out, they're not beat up.
Our guest today on the Champion Series presented by Signature Championship Rings is Brad Dixon, the head football coach, head boys track coach, strength and conditioning coordinator, and physical education teacher at Camp Point Central High School in Western Illinois. He'll be taking on the role of athletic director moving forward. Coach Dixon's been coaching football for 22 years, including the last 14 as head coach at Camp Point Central. During those 14 years, the Panthers have won 11 conference championships, been to the IHSA playoffs 14 straight years, and made a quarterfinal appearance, 2 semifinal appearances, and 3 state championship appearances, finishing runner-up twice and winning the state championship in 2023. Coach Dixon is heavily involved in track football consortium, sprint-based football, working with Tony Holler, and the work they do has been great. We've talked about it before on the podcast with Garrett Mueller, who was one of our first state champions in this series. We're going to dig into a lot here with Coach today. On this episode of our Champions Series presented by Signature Championship Rings, we're going to bookend something we began with at the beginning of this series back in January with Garrett Mueller, who's the head coach, a state champion in Minnesota. We talked about sprint-based football. And today we're going to talk to Brad Dixon, who's the head coach of Camp Point Central High School in Western Central Illinois, and has been heavily involved in sprint-based football, working with Tony Holler, who's been a guest numerous times on the podcast. You guys know I love what they're doing with the sprint-based football, so I'm excited to dig into this and talk to him about how this looks from camp all the way through to a state championship. So, Coach Dixon, it's great to have you here. I appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, excited to be here. Obviously, to be included in a podcast is as awesome as yours. I've listened to a lot of them that you've done with those guys that you mentioned, and obviously Coach Holler's been a great mentor, and I've gotten to know Garrett Mueller really well. So kind of a neat situation to, like I said, start with him and finish the series here. So excited to talk about it.
Before we dig into some of those things, I want to get a little into this evolution for you and what led you to sprint-based football and what it's become for you today.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I played high school football and played a year of college football at the Division III level, and so that kind of molds your mindset of that old school mentality, and that's how I was brought up, and I think how most coaches in today's day and age were coached in a way of turning boys into men and a militaristic, heavy focus of conditioning. We're going to outwork everybody, and that's just kind of the way I was brought up. So after playing a year of college football, I started coaching at the high school level at the age of 19 and coached as an assistant for maybe about 7 years, I think, or so. And then was able to become a head coach, maybe 8 years, be able to become a head coach, I think at the age of 26 or 27, and still had that same mentality and had a lot of success. We had our first 9-0 my first year as a head coach in school history and got beat in the second round, and then reeled off 3 straight undefeated regular seasons, quarterfinals, semifinals, 44-5 through our first 4 years. And I was doing it the old school way, what I call the old school way now, of conditioning heavy and pretty much destroying our guys each week and hoping for the best on Friday nights or Saturday afternoons. And then we hit kind of a couple different things happen. We hit kind of a lull in 2015. We had a rash of injuries, season-ending type injuries. We had 3 in one game, different things happen. We snuck into the playoffs at 5-4, having to win, I think, our last 3 games, and got blown out in the playoffs, something like 55 or 56-7 in the first round. And then in 2016, we had a first-round loss, being 7-2. And so we just weren't experiencing the same types of success. Like I said, we had lots of injuries and different things. And then at that same time, around the spring of 2017, I started coaching track and field. So we had all these things going on. I started coaching track, and I quickly realized that if I coached my track kids like my football kids, they were all going to be beat up, and we were going to be slow, and I hate to lose. And so quickly I was like, okay, we got to do something different. That led me to Tony Holler and some of his thoughts in track and field. And so I liked what I was hearing and was kind of buying into what he was selling. And then in the summer of 2017, he wrote an article, like really late July, wrote an article about new school ideas for old school football coaches. And it was like one of the first lines was, football doesn't look much different than it did 40 years ago. Conditioning, up, downs. And I was like, damn, he's right. And the problem was it was so close. We were in the middle of camp. We were about to have our off week, and then we were going to start our season. And so I wasn't willing to throw everything out at that point in time. So middle of that season, though, we had hit another lull. We were 2-2. We hadn't been playing very well, and we decided to kind of make the switch mid-year in 2017 where we took the pads off only one day a week. We stopped conditioning on Mondays, really stopped conditioning all the time, really backed off how much we were running our guys, how much we were hitting them, and we went on to win 5 straight games and lost a heartbreaker in the second round of the playoffs on a failed 2-point conversion. And from that point on in 2018, we were all in with the script, and we've been kind of tweaking it ever since. But when we started there in 2018, there was no manual. There were no art. There was one article Tony wrote and a few conversations I had. So that's kind of how it evolved into what it is today. And then we've just continued to try to tweak it.
Yeah, and I love what you guys have done together and what this has looked like with your clinics that you guys are doing all over the country now, and bringing in guys who are doing this and adapting it to what they do. And you really see, I think as Tony likes to say, like, I'm not going to give you the recipe, but I'm going to teach you to cook, meaning that everybody's going to have to adapt this in the way that fits best to their athletes and to their program and the different things that they go through. And I think that's what I love about this. It's not necessarily do it exactly this way and here's the proven results. I mean, you still, as a coach, need to learn and understand and apply what you're doing, just like you would with any scheme. I mean, taking a scheme right out of a playbook and saying, hey, we're going to do it this exact way doesn't guarantee success because someone had it before. So it's really about learning and growing as a coach and educating yourself. And I think you guys are at the forefront of that with what you're doing and bringing other people into these clinics. I mean, it's just a wealth of knowledge you guys have put together.
Yeah, like I said, I'm in rural Illinois, Class 1A school, which is the smallest class, public school, 230 kids. This year we're going to have our biggest number, which is going to be at 58 that we've had in my 20 years there. But we're not a 2-platoon. Last year, our biggest guy on our offensive line was 205 pounds. So our situation is different than someone's situation that may have 2-platoon. They may have 100 kids on their roster. They may be at a private school. So everyone's situation is different. But some of the main concepts and principles that we try to live by: make football the best part of a kid's day, worry more about their health and recovery than you do even practice. Just some of the main things: make sprinting the priority. Lifting should supplement what you're doing on the field. Those types of main key points of sprint-based football and a lot of people think that it's just we go out there with helmets, we do a few things, and then we go get off the field. I mean, we are a wing T, double tight, power run team that rushed for, I think, 4,500 yards last year or more. In the state game, we played another wishbone, double tight, wing T team that had over 5,000 yards and a 2,500-yard running back that had won 3 straight state championships running it down people's throat. So we're not a spread. Some people think, well, yeah, it's only for the spread. You get your athletes out in space. And obviously, if you were in the spread, you want guys to be fast. But we are in a power run team with a bunch of farm kids in rural Illinois that we prioritize their health, we prioritize their speed, and we get our guys to play extremely physical and extremely fast because they feel good. They feel excited about Friday night. They're not worn out. They're not beat up. And those main key concepts can transverse all kinds of different schemes in everyone's situation. But how you structure practice and how you manipulate it to fit your situation is kind of the beauty of it, because your kid's best, you know your situation best, your opponent's best.
And that's what we're going to dig into here, and really taking a look at these different phases of the season. We're about to head into camp here within a couple weeks, and so thinking this through from camp all the way to a state championship. So let's talk about camp first. It's always the most grueling time of the year because of the heat that's involved at that time of the year, and guys doing, a level of work that they've been preparing for this, but Now is when the rubber hits the road, so to speak. So what does camp look like for you from that sprint-based football perspective?
Yeah, I'm going to rewind a little bit back to when our season ends in November. I literally want our guys. So we have athletic PE, and I've been fortunate enough to be the guy that's taught that as well. So our guys are training during the school day, speed, agility, acceleration, and weightlifting all year long. So we're going to already check that box off. That's already being done. But at our level especially, I want our guys to get as far away from football as possible. So not from the relationships and things, but we don't talk football. We don't talk scheme. We don't have spring practices, which we can't in Illinois, but we don't try to circumvent the rules. We're in the summer right now, and it's July, mid-July, and we had our first day of helmets of football, period, for the summer. So our guys have trained 3 days a week. They come in from 8 to 9:30. We did 2 kind of basic walkthrough days in June, and then we're going to have about 9 days in July where we do football things. We're going to do a couple joint practices with a couple bigger schools, and then we're going to have our own little team camp. And that's our July, for the reason of when we get to fall camp, we want the kids to be so excited that football is finally here. I think if we do football from December in some fashion, right, from December all the way to August in some fashion, right? You're bringing guys in here and you're doing this, and their August doesn't mean as much to them. To our guys, I feel like what we do best is nothing against the other sports, right? We've had baseball stuff this summer. We've had basketball stuff, and we've let our kids have all that time to do that. And then when we hit August, it's all right, guys, it's finally time for football. Let's go. And so I think that's where it starts. Your guys need to be excited and not worn out by the time, because maybe you did 30 or 40 football days in the summer and every day you were doing football stuff. And I think too many coaches overvalue their ability to coach and undervalue their athletes. So in other words, they spend way too much time on scheme and practice reps, because as a coach, every coach thinks they're going to out scheme everybody. And as long as we have all this stuff in, then we're going to win. When in reality, happy, healthy athletes that are explosive and have the skill are going to be what wins the game, not you as a coach. And that's just, like I said, we overvalue ourselves and undervalue the kids a lot. So that's where we start. But when we start practice, and I think it was an Eric Corum quote when we start fall camp, coaches, and he said it in the first week, said coaches should be nervous or anxious or scared about how little they do in the first week. And I know that sounds lazy, but I always say when you have a sprint-based football practice, it's hard. In my opinion, lazy is planning a 3-hour practice. That's easy to me because you have all this time. But if you say, hey, on day one, we're only going to go 2 hours and 25 minutes of that's going to be a sprint workout at the beginning, that makes you be very efficient. It makes you cut out all the things that aren't necessary. And so in that first week, we're going to kind of alternate between some longer practices, but with some half times built in and things, and then some followed by some shorter practices. And we're going to kind of alternate that same high-low model that we're kind of high CNS and there's more sprinting involved. We're going to come back and have a more fundamental practice where we're working more of the game plan type stuff and the technique type stuff, and a smaller area. We're going to cut the field down so that we can come back the next day and have another high intense practice. Whereas the old school idea and how we used to do it, right, it was on day one, like we want to get to the point, and literally it happens, right? It happens a lot at the college level, not a lot, but more than it ever should, where guys literally die in those preseason practices because of the work that's done, right? That should never happen. We should never put kids in that situation, because in a football game, they may only be playing 12 minutes of actual play in a 2-hour period. But we want to cram 3 hours of constant movement onto day one, where we start with all this conditioning and all this different stuff. And literally kids are just trying to survive. And so S&C coaches, especially at the college level, are at a huge, they're not even trying to get their guys ready for the season. They're trying to get their guys ready for fall camp, because they know it's not the season that's going to destroy them. It's fall camp. You look at the NFL. When do the majority of ACLs and Achilles and hamstrings? It's not late in the season. It's not mid-season. It's fall camp. It's when everyone starts in July, because most coaches do too much too early, and they don't build it in because everyone thinks they're behind and we got to throw all this stuff at them in game one, when in reality, you've got to build those kids in. And even kids that are training, like our kids train all year long, but we're not trying to throw everything at them day one. And we want them to come back day two. They're going to feel it a little bit, right? Because they're going through a practice they haven't went through in a little while. But we're very mindful even in that first week. So all throughout fall camp, we have that same mindset. And we have a plan in place of how we install things and when we install things. But not in any of that is a time build out to get on the line and run, or do up downs, or do the old county fair that we used to do in the 100-yard bear crawls and all that different stuff. We don't do any of that stuff. We progress our practices by how many group plays we get and how many live plays, and those progress in our helmets. So we start at a certain number when we first start in helmets. We progress that up. And then when we put the shoulder pads on and there's a little more contact, that volume drops of our live plays. And then we progress that up. And then when we get to put full pads on, that volume drops. And we progress that up. And we hit our highest volume in fall camp on the Wednesday before our scrimmage. We try to get somewhere around half of the amount of plays that we're going to get in the scrimmage. Then we have a scrimmage. And then we try to hit somewhere around that half a number of plays that we're going to get in a game on the Wednesday before we play our first week. And then from there, I'll be honest, it's based upon our opponents as we get into the season on how hard we're going to go.
I think there's a lot to chew on right there. A couple things I want to point out. One, you mentioned Eric Quorum, and we had a great episode with Eric a few years back about scripting your team into shape so that you're not having that game one. He called it the game one conundrum, that, hey, we're out of shape, right? So I'll share that link in the show notes, and you'll want to dig into that. It's really good stuff here that Coach referred to. I wanted to point out, you mentioned day one, we're going to start with a sprint workout. And I know a key element to the training in Tony Holler and the sprint-based football that you guys do is that you're going to train speed while the athlete's fresh, where you typically have seen, and it's not really speed training, but the conditioning at the end of practice where you guys are putting this right up front.
Absolutely. We want to get that CNS firing right off the bat. If you've done it right and you've done your summer right, your kids are excited for the first day of practice. If you've destroyed them all summer and then they walk into that first day of practice and they know that the next week's going to be absolute hell because they're going to just get destroyed day in and day out, then they're probably not excited. But we always start with a sprint period on the first day of practice. And this is a thing we do at the small school level that I think is unique to a lot of people. We have a small staff. Some years it's only 4 coaches. Some years it's 5. So when we do that fall camp, we split our roster in half, and we have a varsity practice that we can go faster and add bigger elements to it or more intensity to it and some more difficulty to it in terms of scheme and things. And then those guys go home. And then the coaches, we don't really feed the cats during that time because we're grinding out 2 practices. But then we take an hour break and then we bring in our young kids and they have their own separate practice where we can go at a pace for them. And like the freshmen and the sophomores that aren't ready aren't stuck with the going against an older guy. And so we also do that at the beginning of fall camp, which I think is key. And so they have their own sprint period. So yeah, fresh soft kid that's not as fast as that senior, he might win that first day of practice with the young kids practice. He may be the fastest kid in that group, and they're not comparing themselves to those older guys. So we separate those guys for as long as we can until school starts, obviously, and then we don't have time to have 2 different practices. We're not fortunate enough. That's why everyone's situation is different. We don't have a freshman staff and a JV staff over here and even a fresh soft staff over here and then a varsity staff. We are the staff of a team of somewhere usually between 45 and 55 kids. And so we try to do everything we can to get them the right amount of reps and to get them the reps at the level at which they need them, because that's the other thing. And we can get into it later when we get into a weekly plan, but the whole idea of everyday drills and all this stuff, too many coaches, they're doing drill X on the first day. And then if you look at their week 9 Tuesday, they're doing the same drill that they started with because that's their everyday drill. And so to me, it's one of two things. Either you started that drill on day one and your kids weren't even close to ready, or there's no reason to do that drill in week 9, because if you're still doing that drill or the same version of it, you can tweak it. You can add more components to it to make it more complex. But your drills throughout the year, and I think it was Andy Ryland said his goal in coaching is to render his drills as useless as possible, as fast as possible. In other words, the kids have learned the technique. They understand what you want from them. We don't need to do that drill anymore. And so that's our goal throughout the year as well. And that's why we're able to shorten our practice and cut out things, because we don't have this 40-minute everyday drill circuit where kids are just getting tired essentially because they're not working on any skills that are going to make them better.
Yeah, Andy always loves to talk about everyday skills rather than everyday drills, right? What is the skill you need to develop? And that does evolve. The needs for it evolve over the course of the season. And it's a completely different topic as you get into ecological dynamics and constraint-led drills and practices. That there's a lot to chew on there. Maybe we'll get into that one on another time, but it's thinking about that evolution of your athletes over the course of the year. So I'm in agreement with you there. And I would like to now, we've talked about camp and what that looks like and how the volume scales up as you're going through. And then, yeah, school's going to start and we're going to settle into that after school routine, game week routine, and especially looking at the early season there, those first few weeks of the season. What is that going to look like?
Yeah, I mean, so for us, we play on Friday nights pretty exclusively. And I feel like maybe we've reached the pinnacle of the official shortage and we're swinging back the other way. But like this year, all of our games, I think, but one are on Fridays. We've had a few years where we've had to play Saturdays due to official shortages. So if you're listening to this and you want to help the game of football, sign up to be an official in whatever state you're listening in, because our young people need them. So from a varsity standpoint, on Mondays, we don't take the field. So if we really go back to Saturday, Sunday, our kids are off. We don't bring them in for film. We don't do any of that stuff. We share everything through Huddle Messenger, Google Drive. We send all of our player notes and all of our specific things to our individual groups, our individual players. Our coaches do all their game planning on their own, and then we share it all digitally. We text each other. We don't have these 5 and 6 hour coaches meetings again, which the old, I think I've heard Tony say this too, tired coaches are poor coaches. So just like your players, if you're bringing your coaches in on Saturday morning and then you're meeting on Sunday and they're working 7 days a week. And I'm not saying that we don't work during the football season 7 days a week. I go out and do the laundry on Saturdays, but I do it when I have time, and I usually bring my son out or whatever. So it's not something where we're organizing a specific time. So we do the same thing with our players. We encourage them to relax on the weekend, do your film work, get yourself prepared. And then on Mondays then is our film day. That's our review specific things. So because we've shared our film notes and we've shared our things from the previous game, that film session can be pretty short of our previous opponent. We'll hit on a few key things that maybe we did really well. We try to focus on things that we did well, 2-1, 3-1, 4-1, and things that we did poorly. And we do that in our individual time with our individual coaches. And then we move on to the game plan. We also have done a book study, and that's a good time for Mondays, where we've done the Twin Thieves, where we have 3 or 4 questions over the weekend too. And then we have discussion time on it on Mondays. And before we had every athlete in athletic PE, that was also considered a sprint day for us, where we would sprint during that same practice time. Now, because of athletic PE, we get done our sprint work on Monday. So after the players have had 2 days of rest on Saturday and Sunday, Monday for us becomes our sprint day. And I know there's people that go back and forth, and some people use Monday as kind of a prep day to sprint on Tuesday. And I understand both ways. And sometimes we do that depending on the week of where we're at. Sometimes we'll do that. But for the most part, that Monday is when we're going to do that. Then Tuesday is more of our actual game plan day in helmets. So we're just in helmets and we go against hand shields, and we're working on like the scheme that we're going against or specific techniques, because that kind of dictates where we're at as the season goes on. And we like to do offense and defense on the same day. I know a lot of people have an offensive day and a defensive day if they're not two platooning. But my thought is, if sometimes things look really good on film and you think something's going to work, and if Wednesday, let's say, is your defensive day and you're playing on Friday, and then you get home that night and you watch the practice film and you realize, wow, that I don't like any of that. I don't like how we lined up to that. This is not good. When do you have time to fix it? So that's kind of what our Tuesdays are for. So we film everything. We take a look. Obviously, we're not taking guys to the ground, but we're still lining up. We can still do our 7-on-7. We can do that kind of stuff. And that gives us a good idea of how our stuff looks against our opponent. And then that sets us up for a Wednesday that we're going to get after it a little bit. And again, it depends on our opponent. And this is kind of counterintuitive thought. But if our opponent's really good on Friday, we're actually going to back off a little bit through the week because our dudes are going to have to play more. The game's going to be more physical. They're going to have to play into the fourth quarter. And so we need, if you think of a pie chart and you start, let's say, by some chance a kid walks into your film session on Monday with 100% of their energy, which never happens with the weekend and working and their social life and their cell phone and everything. You've got a choice. You don't get to determine what happens at their job, generally what happens in their social life, right? We can talk about putting your phones away and going to bed and all that. They've got issues going on at home. Their other classes, maybe they're in high-level physics and calc, and they've got huge tests that week. They're working on college stuff, but you can dictate the piece of the pie that is practice or game. So let's say if the rest of the pie after all those other things is 50%, are you taking 40% of their energy in practice and leaving 10% in the game? Or are you taking 10% in practice and leaving 40% to the game? And that doesn't mean that you don't practice. It just means you're mindful of how much you're beating on your guys, knowing that Friday night is going to be a big night if it's a good opponent. And if the opposite's true, if this team is having a down year and they've been running clock 4 times in a row, and that in theory, right, if your guys do what they're supposed to do, your starters are not going to play that much, that you can get after it a little bit more during the week so that you continue. People always asked us this past year because we had a lot of first half running clocks and so forth, that are you scared that your guys aren't going to be ready when the playoffs come? And it's like, well, what they don't see is on those weeks where we probably had a first half running clock, we did more volume in practice that week. And again, most people don't think that way. They think, gosh, we're all right, it's playoff time now, or we're playing an undefeated opponent. We got to have the best practice of the year. Yeah, you do from a mental standpoint and a locked-in focus standpoint, but you can get that from your guys without mashing them into the ground. So our Wednesday is determined by the opponent that we think. If it's a game that can go either way, then we don't have it down to an exact science. I can't tell you the exact number, but I can tell by how our guys feel. I can tell by numbers that I track all year, whether it's jump numbers or sprint numbers or acceleration numbers, how they're moving in the weight room. I can tell how over that time, because I spend so much time with them, how they're feeling. And then we back it off on Thursday. We treat it like a rolling track schedule where we have a set list of things that we want to get in, a script, and we want to do it as efficiently as we can and get off the field. And we want to be happy. We finish with trick plays, and we want our guys smiling when they come off the field, excited about the game, feeling good about the game from a mental standpoint, physically feeling like, yes, I'm ready to go tomorrow night. Again, not dragging, not having this and that sore and this is beat up, because guys aren't going to play as well if they feel like that. So, and then our Fridays are the crazy thing that most people do on Friday nights is they get their guys wore out before the game even starts. So we don't have the stupid long warm up where you go out an hour ahead of time and do jumping jacks and get in these militaristic lines and yell the opponent or yell your mascot, spend all this time doing all these drills. We do a freestyle warm up where our kids show up a couple hours before the game. They put their headphones in, they go out, they get themselves, we give them an idea of the things that we want them to do, but then they go out and do it in the way that they need to do it. So our D linemen this year would go out and work on some hand fighting. They'd work on some get-offs. They would do all that when their anxiety level is much lower. It's not 10 minutes before kickoff. It's not with the stadium full. There's nobody there. We do that, and then they go back to the locker room, and we don't come back out until there's about 18 minutes to go on the clock. So we in the gym, we do all of our RPR, reflexive performance reset. We do some other neuro things, And then we do a speed drill sprint kind of wake up. And we do all of that out of the crazy atmosphere that gets everyone all in these heightened state of anxiety, and they're burning all this energy that's very finite on a Friday night. And so when we take the field, generally our opponents have been out there for 30 minutes already doing all kinds of crazy stuff. We come out, we do a little bit of a position specific, quick little wake up, and then we run some plays and we're ready to kick it off. And then, like I said, then we take Saturday and Sunday off. So that's essentially what our week looks like.
Yeah, when you talk about that pregame warm-up, I mean, what you described there is very much like you go early to an NFL game. Very similar, that those guys actually don't go through a very long warm-up period. But like you said, hours beforehand, they are out there individually, headphones on, working things at their pace, maybe with some other guys, maybe on their own. It's typically what you see there. So to think about there in terms of especially that emotional side of the players, I mean, you don't want to burn all that energy that you normally do. And I know I've been guilty of it before, those long, very emotional warm-up periods. And you got to the point where we used to say to each other, hey, we don't need to win the warm-up today.
Right. I always think if our opponents are doing a lot of yelling and screaming, I feel pretty good. If they look like they're focused and they think they're not doing a bunch of crazy stuff, then I know we're probably going to be in a battle because their kids are pretty locked in. The screamers and the yellers are the kids and the staffs and the programs that have to prove before in the pregame how much they're ready to go. But it's those quiet guys that get focused. They don't need to do all the rah-rah stuff. And those are the ones that are going to kick your butt on Friday night.
Coach, appreciate that detailed look at what a game week looks like. And I really like what you explained as far as how those weeks are going to vary depending on who you're playing and how your kids are feeling and how you gauge those things. What in general does the taper look like for you, if any, as you get into the middle weeks and later parts of the season?
Yeah, I mean, so we're very fortunate that we implemented this a couple years ago, but we moved our homeroom time to the end of the day. So our last period of the day ends at, I think, right around 2:30, where kids can go to homeroom and get help if they need to, or if you drive, you can go home, or if you have practice, you can go to practice. So we're generally starting practice by 2:45, 2:50. So we're trying to walk off the practice field, never past 4:45. But as we get into the middle and later weeks, right, when we're not reinventing, we know who we are. We know what version of our wing tee we are this year, or what we're a multiple kind of odd front team, but it morphs to different things based on your strengths and weaknesses each year. We've kind of got that established by then, and we're just adding little wrinkles and tweaks and counters and things like that. So we try to be done by 4:30. So our kids are literally coming off the field at 4:30. It's not 6:30 at night. They've got time to go home, relax a little bit if they got homework, whatever. Or even some of them still try to work and do different things, but more so even for our coaches, because if our coaches can leave practice and pick their kids up from daycare on one of those, I mean, that's a huge deal. So again, we've got a small school. So I've got two main guys that are in the building. We have a couple other guys that are outside the building that help us, but the two main guys that are in the building we've been together now as a staff for the last, I think, 16 years. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that our time is valuable and we don't waste time. So we keep our spouses happy and our family life's better. And too many coaches get divorced and things over the amount of time that they're spending in the office and such. And I've had multiple testimonies, several from college football coaches that said there were so many times that they had to be in the office a certain amount of hours with nothing to do because their head coach expected them to be there. And it's crazy that you put this time quotient that you got to put X amount of time in, when my philosophy is everyone knows their job. When you get your work done, whether you're a morning person or an evening person in terms of your film prep and all that stuff, just get it done. And it gives our coaches that freedom, gives our players the freedom if we get them out of there at 4:30. So that's what we're trying to do. And then once we get into the playoffs, again, most people think they got to double down. So we finish week 9 on a Friday night. we don't play usually until that next Saturday. So we'll give our kids Saturday, Sunday, Monday completely off. Tuesday becomes our Monday, which was our film day. Wednesday becomes our helmets. Thursday then becomes our full pads. And so if our kids took their pads off on Friday night, they're not putting their shoulder pads on again on playoff week until Thursday, because then Friday is our prep day and then Saturday. And so a lot of people would freak out about that because it's playoff time. But then as we get into those Saturday games, Sunday and Monday become our completely off days. So we don't practice at all on Monday. Tuesday becomes our film day, and everything gets pushed back. Just because we have that extra day of prep, we shouldn't need an extra day at that point in time, because we know who we are. Our job at this point is, if we're good enough to compete for a state championship, then our goal is to keep our guys as healthy and fresh as possible. And if you're not good enough to compete for a state championship, then that extra day of practice isn't going to make the difference anyway.
Coach, and then to finish up, in terms of your sprint workouts, mid into late season into the playoffs, Tony always says, don't burn the steak. What do those look like for you? How are you approaching the sprint workouts that you normally do beginning of the week?
Yeah, so then a lot of times then we'll shift those to a Tuesday. So when we get into the playoffs, then Monday will usually become like an upper body day. And by the time we're into the playoffs, we're focused more on velocity-based lifting and speed work, and we're getting in and getting out, because most other programs too, depending, the fall sports they're wrapping up and the winter sports are starting. So in my class, I may have kids that are ending their football season and kids that are starting basketball and wrestling. Well, both of them are kind of at the same level. Basketball and wrestling are super tough sports where kids are practiced for 2.5 hours. They're intense. It's constant movement. So it works out pretty well because multiple kids are kind of at the same level, same thing in playoff football and such. So we shift all that stuff a week. Our guys know that if things don't feel right, and a lot of times I can see it in the way that they're, we call it a wake up, but in the way they're warming up, but they know they have the ability to say, Coach, this still bugging me here or there. We don't sprint them if they're not feeling great. And fortunately, we played in the state game and played every playoff game this year with 100% of our varsity roster. And our guys were, I think, as fast as they were in that quarterfinal, semifinals of the entire season. We had 8 guys, I think, over 21 mile an hour in either the quarterfinals or the semifinals, which, again, you think about a long, grueling football season. Most people, if they're not tracking speed and they're not training it, then they're probably 1 mile an hour, 2 mile an hour, maybe even 3 mile an hour slower than they were to start the year. And so we constantly monitoring that. We're constantly monitoring their vertical jump. Obviously, if the vertical jumps are down 2, 3, 4 inches, then your guys are going to need more recovery, and that should dictate how you're practicing and whether certain guys should practice. Because, again, at that point in the year, you know who your dudes are, who you can count on. And if one of those guys isn't feeling 100%, you're probably doing more of a disservice by putting them out there in practice. And the ones that really are bought in, which hopefully are your best players, they want to practice. If you set them out of certain things, it's really going to make them mad and even more hungry to play on Friday night. But at the end of the day, you think that's what's best to make sure that your best guys are ready to go. I mean, that's a concession that we make, and we're upfront with why we do that with our guys.
Coach, I really appreciate you sharing the details of your approach. There's definitely more you can dig into as coaches here and things that are useful heading into the season. Incredible library of resources that have been put together, and we'll share the link to those in our show notes. Coach, again, thank you for the time. Thank you for sharing your insight into what's helped you become a state champion, and certainly best of luck to you and the Panthers in your quest for a repeat here in 2024.
Thank you, and appreciate the opportunity.
Here are winning edge takeaways and ideas for implementation. 1. Understand the training philosophy behind your program. Coach Dixon's philosophy focuses on making football the best part of the player's day. This involves minimizing exhaustive conditioning and maximizing the efficiency of practice sessions. Practices are structured to be shorter and more intense, with strong emphasis on sprinting and reducing wear and tear on his athletes placed up front. This approach helps keep players excited and physically prepared for games. 2, be adaptable and take an athlete-centric approach. The sprint-based football model is adaptable to various team sizes and situations. Coach Dixon highlights that it's not about providing a rigid playbook, but teaching coaches how to tailor the principles to their specific context. This includes making sprinting a priority, ensuring practices are enjoyable, and focusing on the overall well-being of the athletes. Coach Dixon's success with a small rural high school team underscores the effectiveness of this adaptable and athlete-centric approach. And 3, when you have time, think about a transition to some of these sprint-based football principles. Brad Dixon shifted from an old-school conditioning-heavy football training approach to a sprint-based method inspired by Tony Hollard. This change was driven by a series of injuries and the realization that traditional conditioning methods were not yielding the desired results. The new approach prioritizes the health and recovery of athletes, reducing heavy conditioning and emphasizing speed and agility training.